George Santayana, he said this: "Those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it." History, it is not always pleasant. Sometimes history is a little painful. American history, for instance, there are several rough patches in our history as America. Have you ever heard of the Indian Removal Act of 1830? Has anybody ever heard that? Good! You're a senior. You should have known. Nice!
Well,
Okay, you're a little late to the party. Well, glad you learned that. For those of you who maybe have not learned this, I'll bring you up to speed. President Andrew Jackson and Congress, they passed by one vote this act. And in this act, it took roughly 60,000 Indians, and they were forced to travel what has now become known as the Trail of Tears. And they have sometimes traveled as far as upwards of 1,000 miles they had to travel by foot. And along the way, thousands died. And the reason that all of this took place was so that more land in the growing U.S. was available for purchase. What about internment camps? Has anybody ever heard of internment camps? Okay, good. History is good in here. I like it. In 1942, toward the beginning of World War II, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president, he signed Executive Order 9066. And this order, it uprooted 120,000 Japanese Americans that were all along the West Coast, and they ended up taking them and they put them in internment camps. 62% of that 120,000 Japanese Americans, they were U.S. born. They were citizens that way. And they were held in these internment camps for the duration of World War II. As a society, those moments are not necessarily our finest moments. I didn't mention slavery, but they are all part of our history as Americans. And they're important for us to know, and they're important for us to learn from. In the same way, the Old Testament, it is chock full of history. When you read through the Old Testament, there is so much history that is just packed in there. And there is a real historical timeline that takes place that the whole Bible fits into. Take, for instance, Genesis. Okay? Start at the very beginning. Genesis, it deals with origins. It deals with the origin of life, whether it's plant life, animal life, human life. Genesis, it deals with the origin of sin. You see the first instance of humans where they take their free will and they rebel against a holy God. It's recorded in Genesis. You see in Genesis, it has the origins of nations, specifically the nation of Israel. It is in Genesis where Israel gets its start. So, in order for us to better understand some of the books of the Bible, we have to have a rough idea of the biblical backdrop to those books. And today, we get to embark on a new sermon series. We're going to launch into the book of Daniel. So if you got your Bibles, you can turn over. We're not going to be in Daniel much today at all. We have one verse that we're going to talk about. But this sermon series, it is entitled Daniel, Serving the Sovereign God. Many of us, we probably know some of these Sunday school stories that we've heard in the book of Daniel. You have Daniel in the fiery furnace, the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego account. You've got the feast and the handwriting on the wall. You've got Daniel in the lion's den, just to name a few. We're going to look at those. But our understanding of those real historical events, they are greatly improved when we begin to grasp the historical context that leads up to those events. And that's exactly what we're going to look at today. We're going to look at the historical context leading up to the book of Daniel. So, we've entitled today's message, Biblical Backdrop. But before we dive into it, let's pray. Lord, I pray right now, Lord, this is going to be a little bit of a history lesson. Lord, I pray that you will meet with us, that you will absolutely open our eyes, Lord, to the lessons that we can learn. Lord, there is so many more lessons to this than we're even going to scratch the surface of today. But Lord, I pray that you meet with us, that you challenge us, and that you really prepare us for this study in the book of Daniel. And we thank you for it all. We pray this in your name. Amen. All right. It's important that we kind of get a little backdrop, even in the book of Genesis. Genesis, it's broken up into 4 events, and that's recorded in Genesis chapters 1 through 11, and 4 people. Okay? And that's Genesis 12 through 50. Okay? If you're processing that with me, here are the 4 events. You have creation, fall, flood, nations. That happens Genesis 1 through 11. Okay? And then you have also the 4 people, and the 4 people are Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, which is later named Israel, and you also have Joseph. Those are the 4 people and the 4 events that take place in Genesis. Midway through Jacob's life, God gives Jacob a little bit of a name change. He goes from Jacob, which his name means holder of the heel, or grabber of the heel, to Israel, which means he struggles with God, or may God prevail. So from Israel, or Jacob, you have the 12 tribes. The 12 tribes of Israel, or the nation of Israel, comes through this line, through Jacob, or Israel. Eventually, as you kind of process this is the origin of Israel. Eventually, this nation of Israel, they want a king. And specifically, the guy that they target is a guy by the name of Saul. Now, it's already been mentioned that last night we had the Night of Excellence. And our very own Hannah, she came up and she shared poetry, correct me if I'm wrong, poetry that she had written. And that inspired me. Okay? So I have a little poem for you that I wrote. This is my really weak, lame attempt at poetry. Saul's not small, Saul's tall. Oh, the gall of Saul! Soon after the call, there's a fall. Use your wherewithal. Don't be like Saul. Thank you. Thank you. Outwardly Saul, he looked to be a great king. He had all the qualities outwardly, but inwardly Saul wanders from God. The next king on the list, you've got Daniel. Daniel is the next king. And this is kind of a rags. It's up there. It's David. And I mispronounced it. See, I got my head all in Daniel. All right, David. He's the next king. Daniel never was king. But David, he is a rags to riches kind of guy. It's kind of this poor shepherd boy. And then he goes to this arguably the greatest king in all of Israel's history. So, if you look at the history of this, Samuel, he is tasked by God to locate the next king of Israel. And Samuel, he goes to the house of Jesse. And Jesse's 7 older sons, they are all presented before Samuel. And the answer to each one of them is no, 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 no. And then Samuel's like, okay, is there anyone else here? And he's like, okay, well, there's David, and he's kind of a shepherd, and he's out in the fields. I can go get him if you really like. He's like, okay, bring me David. So David comes on in, and the glass slipper fits, or he's anointed king. He actually becomes the next king of Israel. After David, you have his son Solomon, and he becomes the next king of Israel. And you think about that. You think about the big shoes that Solomon has to fill. David is a loved king. David did so many wonderful, awesome things for Israel. And Solomon, he starts off awesome. And he gets one wish from God. And the one wish that he requests, Solomon requests wisdom. And God, he grants him this wisdom. But somewhere along the way, Solomon's greatest strength, his wisdom, it ends up becoming his biggest weakness. because he starts to rely more and more on self and less on God. Before we kind of flash forward into any of the history with this, I want to warn us. Be careful not to rely on your own abilities, your own strength, because it can only take you so far. When you think about God, God is an inexhaustible resource. His strength, it's never ending. It's never beyond, it's way beyond our comprehension. It's never something we can even fully grasp. But if you're only relying on your own strength, it will only take you so far. I got a chance to meet this kid over here. He's got biceps that are like my thighs. They're huge. No offense, your strength's only going to take you so far. You got to rely on God. That's the reality. And so God, wherever we fall short, and we all fall short somewhere, God, if we allow Him, He takes over the rest of the way. And a lot of times we just need to completely get out of the way and let God go. So, all that being said, Solomon, back to history. Solomon disobeys God. And Solomon does three things specifically. Solomon, he multiplies wives, he multiplies wealth, and he multiplies war horses. Now, these were big issues. This was very problematic because Solomon's security, it was outside of God. Solomon was looking to other things instead of God as his source of strength. When it comes to wives, Solomon's security, it was in his treaties that he made with all these other nations. Because that's really what these marriages, they represented. It was ways to kind of have a peace treaty between one nation and yours. Not to mention when he brought in these wives, they brought with them their false gods and their false idols and their false religions. And it just started to creep and absolutely corrupt all along the way. So you have that in wives. In wealth, it ended up being a problem because Solomon's security was in his financial abundance. He looked to the wealth that he had, and that was where he found his security. In war horses, Solomon's security, it was in his military strength. Bottom line, it stopped being about God, and it started being about Solomon. So, as history continues, after Solomon, there is a civil war. And the kingdom of Israel, it is split. It's divided in two. You have the northern, which really were creative people. These 10 tribes, they kept the name Israel. They didn't want to change it, so they kept Israel. The 10 tribes in the north were Israel, and the 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin, they were in the south, and they went by the bigger of the 2, Judah. And so this new Israel, their first king in their history after this division, his name was Jeroboam. And for the record, this northern 10 tribes, they never had a good king. They were all bad kings. And eventually, as time kind of goes on, they're taken captive by the Assyrians in 722 BC. Judah, their first king almost sounds like Jeroboam. It's not. It's Rehoboam. There's a little difference. Rehoboam, different guy. Judah, they do a little bit better. Their track record's a little bit better than Israel. Judah has 8 good kings and 11 bad kings. They too, they're taken captive. But they're taken captive by the Babylonians. And when the Babylonians come, they do it in 3 ways to take over Judah. Now, before I get into those 3 waves, I just want to back up for one quick second to kind of put into perspective this little power struggle that took place between the Assyrians and the Babylonians. In 612 BC, Nineveh, you might know it by fame by way of Jonah, that whole story, or Nineveh is the capital of Assyria. You might know that. Nineveh, it falls to the Medes and the Babylonians. At this point, some of the Assyrians, they flee, and they go over to a place called Haran. And in 610 BC, the Medes and the Babylonians, they don't like them even being in Haran, so they push them even further, this time beyond the Euphrates. Now, If you put yourself in the Assyrians' shoes, they've been forced out of what they would call their homeland. And they don't really like that. So the Assyrians, they try to end up getting help. And who do they seek help from? It's from the Egyptians. And the Egyptians, they come on up under Pharaoh Necho II. They're going to travel from Egypt all the way on up to where the Assyrians are to end up fighting Babylon. But as the Egyptians, under Pharaoh Necho, as they are moving up to meet with the Assyrians, Judah's king at the time, King Josiah, he tries to prevent that from happening. At a place called Megiddo, he stops them. And at this place, Josiah's army is soundly defeated. And Josiah is actually killed in this battle. You see that recorded in 2 Chronicles 35, 20 to 24. I'm going to read this. 2 Chronicles 35, 20 to 24. After all this, when Josiah had set the temple in order, Necho, king of Egypt, we call that the Pharaoh of Egypt, came up to make war at Carchemish on the Euphrates. And Josiah went out to engage him. But Necho sent messengers to him, saying, "What have we to do with each other, O king of Judah? I am not coming against you today, but against the house with which I am at war. And God has ordered me to hurry. Stop for your own sake from interfering with God, who is with me, so that we will not destroy you." However, Josiah would not turn away from him, but disguised himself in order to make war with him. Nor did he listen to the words of Necho from the mouth of God, which came to make war on the plain of Megiddo. The archers shot King Josiah, and the king said to his servants, "Take me away, for I am badly wounded." So his servants took him out of the chariot and carried him to the second chariot which he had, and brought him to Jerusalem, where he died and was buried in the tombs of his fathers. All Judah and Jerusalem mourned for Josiah. This is also recorded in 2 Kings, chapter 23, 28 through 30. I'm not going to read that, but if you want to go back and reread that, you can. It's also recorded there. As you stop and think about this, King Josiah, he interjects himself into this conflict. Because if you want to know the reason behind it, he interjects himself because he wants to find favor with Babylon. And this actually is incredibly ironic. And we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. But after this interjection, after this interruption, Egypt, they finally meet up with the Assyrians. And they go, and as they try to go fight Babylon, they are very unsuccessful. Babylon once again soundly defeats them. And at this point, the Assyrians just kind of disappear off the map. You no longer have Assyrians that really start populating in your history books. But the conflict between the Egyptians and the Babylonians, that would be an ongoing conflict. And that is a conflict that is happening behind the scenes in the book of Daniel. This is something that is going back and forth. There is this warring that is happening. Now this is back to the irony. The irony comes in 605 BC. In 605 BC, there's a guy named Nebuchadnezzar. He is now the new king of Babylon, and he chooses in 605 BC to attack Jerusalem. The same Jerusalem that kind of went out on a limb to protect and try to stop and get favor with them, that didn't go so well, because Nebuchadnezzar, he wanted things. And this attack, it ends up taking Daniel and his friends. That's the point in the history timeline where Daniel and his friends are taken captives. I want to say it can be easy, if we're not careful, to end up getting sidetracked and look at some of our human strengths, or maybe organizations or things around us for help or answers, instead of maybe relying solely on God for the answers that we so desperately crave. Back to history. In 597 BC, King Nebuchadnezzar, he returns to Judah in a second wave. This second wave is in response to Jehoiachin's rebellion. And in this attack that Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon do, in this attack, you end up having 10,000 captives taken away and brought back to Babylon. During this point, Ezekiel is one of those captives that are taken away. In 2 Kings 24, 8 through 16, this event is taking place. You see it. It's also written at the beginning of Ezekiel and over in 2 Chronicles as well. But this is what it says in 2 Kings 24, 8 through 16. Jehoiachin was 18 years old when he became king, and he reigned 3 months in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Nahashta, the daughter of Elnathan of Jerusalem. He did evil in the sight of the Lord according to all that his father had done. At that time, the servants of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, went up to Jerusalem, and the city came under siege. And Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, came to the city, while his servants were besieging it. Jehoiachin, the king of Judah, went out to the king of Babylon. He and his mother, and his servants, and his captains, and his officials. So the king of Babylon took him captive in the 8th year of his reign. He carried out from there all the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the king's house, and cut in pieces all the vessels of gold which Solomon, king of Israel, had made in the temple of the Lord, just as the Lord had said. Then he led away into exile all Jerusalem, and all the captains, and all the mighty men of valor, 10,000 captives, and all the craftsmen, and all the smiths. None remained except the poorest people of the land. So he led Jehoiachin away into exile to Babylon. Also the king's mother, and the king's wives, and his officials, and the leading men of the land, he led away into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon, all the men of valor, 7,000, and all the craftsmen and the smiths, 1,000, all strong and fit for war. And these the king of Babylon brought into exile to Babylon. Basically, in this wave 2, at the end of it, Jerusalem is left powerless and poor. And all those man-made securities, all the things that Solomon, that king, had kind of put together for himself, they didn't last. They just kind of disappeared. And they never do last. They always, at some point, they deteriorate. They fall apart. They don't go the way that we want them to. And in 588 BC, Nebuchadnezzar, he returns for the third and final time. Following a long siege, Jerusalem's walls, they're finally breached. And the city, it is now destroyed. And in 586 BC, that temple, the glorious temple that Solomon had built, it ends up being burned. And everyone that is left from this attack, anyone that's left alive, they're taken captive into Babylon. You see that in 2 Kings 25, 1 through 7. And it says there, Now in the 9th year of his reign, on the 10th day of the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came, he and all his army, against Jerusalem, camped against it, and built a siege wall all around it. So the city was under siege until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. He was the king of Judah at that point. On the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine was so severe in the city that there was no food for the people of the land. Then the city was broken into, and all the men of war fled by night by way of the gate between the 2 walls beside the king's garden. Though the Chaldeans, which are also Babylonians, they were all around the city, and they went by the way of Arabah. But the army of the Chaldeans pursued the king and overtook him in the plains of Jericho, and all his army was scattered from him. Then they captured the king and brought him to the king of Babylon at Ribiah, and he passed sentence on him. They slaughtered the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes, then put out the eyes of Zedekiah and bound him with bronze fetters and brought him to Babylon. There are low points in Jewish history, but I don't know of many lower than this. This might be one of the lowest points in all of Jewish history. I want you to realize, no matter how dark things are right now, there is always hope. As long as there is breath in your lungs, there is hope. I want you to turn to God. Please don't rely on yourself. Rely on the Savior. And in 539, last point on our trip, 539 BC, Darius, he overthrew Babylon. And he established the Medo-Persian Empire. And this is the empire that would eventually allow Israel to return to their land. This is the empire that Daniel would actually serve under during the whole lion's den situation. And Daniel, he ends up continuing to serve in this empire under King Cyrus until at least the 3rd year of Cyrus's reign. And as I said, this is the one verse in Daniel 10:1. In the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a message was revealed to Daniel, who was named Belshazzar. And the message was true, and one of great conflict, but he understood the message and had an understanding of the vision. So, this is our history lesson. So what? Why do we just spend any time looking at this? The biblical backdrop to Daniel is basically, if you want to summarize it, it is a rebellious nation that is under discipline after repeatedly trying to rely on self, not God. God, he ends up using foreign nations to discipline his children. God, he ends up using the Assyrian Empire to discipline the 10 tribes in the north, Israel. God uses the Babylonian Empire to discipline the 2 tribes in the south, Judah. But there was good news. There was hope. It wasn't going to end there. God would eventually use the Medo-Persian Empire to allow his people to go back to the Promised Land. God wasn't done with the children of Israel. This discipline was only going to be temporary. Now, I'm not sure what point in history, but I find it hard to imagine. Let me back up. I'm sure at this point in history, as you look at it all, it was absolutely hard to imagine. It was hard to process that God's promise of Messiah, that promise of a Savior that you can read all the way back in Genesis, that Christ that was coming. It was probably hard to process that was still ahead. And over 500 years are going to pass after the time of Daniel before God is going to send his Son to be that hope of all the nations. I want you to know that although there are times that you might be facing right now that are hard to imagine, that are hard to kind of grasp, Jesus is coming back. There's coming a day that he's going to be coming back, and he's not coming back this time as a baby. He's coming back this time as the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. He is going to reign forever and ever. Amen. That's going to be a glorious day. All the difficulties that we face on this earth will be done away with. We're going to be having our eternal King forever and always. So, as I said, today it starts our new sermon series, Daniel, Serving the Sovereign God. The book of Daniel, it is great for a variety of reasons. It shows the integrity of a man, Daniel, and it shows the integrity of his friends that are committed to serve God in a hostile world. It also shows that God, he is still in control of everything. He even controls the foreign nations. Isn't it great to know? He's got the whole world in his hands. 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 I don't know about you. I don't know what you're facing today. But can I give you a little bit of encouragement? As you kind of stop from the busyness and the chaos of life, can I give you a little piece of encouragement today? God is sovereign. God is in control of absolutely everything. There is nothing that happens that God doesn't know about. There is nothing that happens that God doesn't allow. And there is nothing that happens that He hasn't complete control over. Whatever you're facing, that might be overwhelming in your own strength. It might be a difficult thing in your own strength to come face to face with. But realize, in God's strength, you can face, you can go through, and you can handle all things. Whatever you're facing, realize, turn to God. He is the solution. The brief biblical history lesson that we just went through, this is the biblical backdrop to the book of Daniel. And it prepares us to realize personally that serving, even when no one is looking, the sovereign God, it is the only way to successfully face the world in which we live. And sometimes that world is tough. That world seems to be out to get us. But I'll tell you, keep your eyes fixed on God is the only solution. Let's pray. Father,